Okay, functional anatomy. First of all, can I just quickly say before I start, I apologize beforehand if I stop and start, or like if I'm talking and I just stop and I start, it's because I'm trying to process the things that I'm saying. So, yeah, let me just put that out there. So, the first part, I'm going to try and break this down as much as possible. So, when it comes to the anatomy of the brain, basically, how you want to start off by describing it is that the brain is split up into it's split up into different regions. Okay, it's divided into different regions, and we can just divide it into three regions, three separate parts, which would be so the brainstem, the cerebellum, and the forebrain. I don't know why that happens. And the forebrain, yeah, I don't know why that happens, but I'll just have to just underline, yeah, and the forebrain. So just to say that again, just so it processes, the brain can be divided into three parts. Part one, the brainstem. Part two, the forebrain. Part two, sorry, the cerebellum, and part three, the forebrain. And so with the brainstem, okay, this over here, sorry, this over here is the brainstem, and the brainstem is over here. This is the brainstem. And how you know that it's the brainstem is that it's connected to the spinal cord. So this over here in yellow is the spinal cord, and you can see that it's connected to this green like structure. That's the brainstem. So when it comes to the brainstem, you can identify the brainstem because it's connected to the spinal cord. Let me just rub that out so it's neater. Yeah. So this is the brainstem. So I'm gonna write over here brainstem connected to spinal cord. Okay. And then moving on, next is the cerebellum. So how you can identify the cerebellum is that the cerebellum, this structure now, is behind the brainstem. So let me just move this. So this is the brainstem, which would mean this over here is the cerebellum. So we can identify the cerebellum because it's behind the brain stem. Okay. And then sorry, something else. With the brainstem, it also performs the most basic functions. That's something else that Julie said, that it performs the most basic functions, is connected to the spinal cord, and also it's the oldest part of the brain. Let me not do that. Okay. It's the oldest part of the brain. Okay. So we've gone through the brainstem, the cerebellum, and the last part is the forebrain. Now the forebrain, that's this part over here. That's this part over here. And the forebrain now, that can be subdivided into, I don't know if this will highlight. No, it won't highlight. It can be subdivided into the cerebrum over here. Sorry. It can be subdivided into the cerebrum or the diencephalon. Okay, so yes, that's the forebrain. So if I just highlight here, so it can be subdivided into the diencephalon or the cerebrum. Okay. And with the forebrain, it's the remainder of the brain. Okay, so we can write over here remainder of the brain. Okay, so that's the take home message. I'm not gonna like talk too much. In Julie's video, she talks a bit more, but these are the most important stuff. So the first part, the brain can be split up into three regions: the brainstem, the cerebellum, and the forebrain. The brainstem is connected to the spinal cord over here. It's connected to the spinal cord. And that's how you know that it's the brainstem. The brainstem is also composed of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. That's what's composed of, that's what makes up the brainstem basically. So you can see even with these lines, you have the top part is the midbrain, the middle part is the pons, and the bottom part is the medulla oblongata, and together they make the brainstem. And then you have the cerebellum. The cerebellum we can identify because this is behind the brainstem. And then you have the forebrain, which is like the top part, and this is the remainder of the brain, and it's subdivided into the diencephalon and the cerebrum. Don't confuse cerebrum with cerebellum. Cerebellum is behind the brainstem, and cerebrum is part of the forebrain. Okay, so another anatomical structure of the brain is that the brain contains cavities, and these cavities are called ventricles. So let's just write that. So so the brain contains cavities, and these cavities contain ventricles, and these ventricles contain cerebral spinal, I don't know why it does that. It contains cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, that's just it. There's nothing else to know. So the brain contains the brainstem, cerebellum, forebrain, and it also contains cavities, and these cavities within the brain are also known as the ventricles, and they contain cerebral spinal fluid. So moving on, now we're going to get a bit more specific. So now we're talking about the brainstem, okay, which would be sorry, I think something's going on with my, what is happening? Sorry, I had to pause real quick. Okay, yeah, so now we're going to talk about the brainstem now. So the take-home message is that the brainstem is also known as a relay center. It's also known as a relay center, okay? And the reason why it's known as a relay center is because if you even look at the position of the brain stem, okay, this is it over here, right? You can see that it's in between the forebrain and the spinal cord. So what happens is it's the center where information from the body, it passes, it goes to the spinal cord, and then it passes via the brainstem to the higher centers of the brain, and that's the reason why it's called a relay center. So Julie has over here information between the higher brain and the spinal cord. So what she means is that all information from the body will travel to the spinal cord via the brainstem to higher centers of the brain. So what she actually means is info from the body passes to spinal cord, and it goes via the brainstem to higher centers of brain. Okay, that's what she actually says. And so basically it's the center where things are going from A to B. Okay, and in the reason why it's also called the relay center is because it's where initial processing happens. So what this basically means is that initial processing can happen because there are synapses over here. in the brainstem. And because there are synapses, it's where it's where the brainstem starts to process signals. Sorry, hold on. Yeah, so it's where the brain can start to process signals going through the brainstem. So basically, the take home message is that initial processing can happen, and initial processing can also be referred to as neural integration. And neural integration can actually take place because there are synapses. You know, like how synapses, they are like the gaps that link neurons together. So, yeah, this is where neural integration happens, and where initial processing can happen. So the brain can start to process signals that are going through the brainstem. I hope that makes sense. Also, the brainstem is important in reticular formation. So, yeah, so it's important in reticular information. And so what reticular formation means is this is a network of neurons throughout the brainstem. That's what reticular formation is. And what happens here is that the brainstem, Julie has written over here, receives and integrates sensory input. What she actually means is that the brainstem receives all sensory information coming from the periphery. So basically, all sensory information coming from the muscles, for example, the periphery means everywhere, right? Everywhere in the body. So all sensory information coming from the periphery, for example, the muscles, it receives that and it integrates that. So she also has over here, it filters unnecessary information. So what happens over here is that the brainstem allows information that's important, and gets rid of information that's not needed. So that's what it means by receives and integrates sensory input, filtering unnecessary information. So it allows information that's important. It allows that to get filtered, and then it gets rid of information that is not needed. So it's basically where a filtering process can happen. Also, in reticular information formation, I don't know why I keep calling it information, sorry. Another thing that I would like to say is, because I don't think I explained this part well, where it says it's a network of neurons throughout the brainstem. No, sorry. Where it says receives and integrates sensory input, that basically means that in the brainstem, it makes sense of all sensory information. That's what it means. And that's what Julie says. That's what I've written down in my notes. So I'm just going to write it over here. So receives and integrates sensory input. What that means is that it makes sense of sensory information. Okay, and then when it says it filtering unnecessary information, what this basically means is that it allows information that's important and gets rid of unnecessary information. Okay, and then also, so reticular formation is also important in consciousness as well. so during consciousness, this is this being aware. So, for example, when you're sleeping, the brainstem, it takes only the important information. So, for example, let's say that you're sleeping and there's a baby crying. You will hear the baby crying and then you will react to that. So it's important in consciousness. And so we can write here consciousness. This is where the brain takes important information. For example, a baby crying. So then you will react to that. By the way, these 3 dots means therefore. So therefore you react to that. So yeah. So again, let me just explain that one more time. With consciousness, that's important in being aware. It helps us basically to be aware of things. So it allows us to be conscious to things, if that makes sense. And during reticular formation, is also important in arousal. Important. So the over here she's put reticular activating system over here. And if you do end up going back to her video, what she explains is that the reticular activating system and reticular formation, they are both important in consciousness and arousal, such as wakefulness. That's basically what she says. She doesn't really go into much detail about arousal and wakefulness. She doesn't really explain that, but she does explain consciousness and what she means by that, which is that it allows us to like be conscious to things. Basically, for example, when a baby's crying, you will react to that. So allowing us to be conscious to things, basically. And another thing is over here, the brainstem as well is also important in balance and posture. So that's another take-home message. So we can just highlight that. So the brainstem is involved in balance and posture. Nope, it won't allow me to. Let's see if I do a different color. Yes. So the brainstem is important in reflexes involved in balance and posture. But just remember balance and posture. The brainstem is important in balance and posture. And then it's the site of exit for most cranial nerves. There's not much said about that. It's just based on memory. So like if we now recap, and I'm sorry if this sounds all complicated. So the take home message is that the brainstem, right, it's referred to as the relay center. Okay, and it's the relay center because it's where information from the body, it passes to the spinal cord via the brainstem over here, and goes to higher centers of the brain, and it's where initial processing can occur, i.e. neural integration. And neural integration can take place due to synapses. So can take place due to synapses. Okay, that's why it's called the relay center. Second thing is it's important in reticular formation. So with reticular formation, the take-home message is that reticular formation is basically where you have a network of neurons throughout the brainstem. And in reticular formation, this is where the brainstem receives and integrates sensory input. So what she means is that this is basically where the brainstem makes sense of all the sensory information. So that's what you need to know about reticular formation. And that in reticular formation, this is where consciousness happens. So basically, with consciousness, it takes important information, and it allows us to be conscious to things, basically react to things. And sorry, I missed out that in reticular formation, there's also a filtering process, and this is where the brain allows information to be filtered. So it takes information that's important and filters out information that's unnecessary. And then we have also in the brainstem, this is where so this is basically where the brainstem is important in balance and posture. And then it's also the site of exit for most cranial nerves. So just remember that it's a relay center. It's where reticular formation happens. It's important in balance and posture, and it's the site of exit for most cranial nerves. And that's in the brainstem. I hope I've not complicated that for you. But let's go on to being a bit more specific. So over here, we just speak about generally what happens or what the brainstem is important in. But over here, now it's a bit more specific as in terms of the structure. So with the brainstem, it has the midbrain over here. It's made up of the midbrain and the medulla oblongata and the pons as well. So now we're going to talk about what the medulla oblongata and the midbrain does. She doesn't really go into what the pons does. So with the medulla oblongata, right, it's so let me just quickly start again. The brainstem is subdivided into several parts, and two of the parts are the medulla oblongata and the midbrain. Okay, so just starting with the medulla oblongata, this is important in involuntary function. That's the take-home message. The medulla oblongata is important in involuntary function. So just in case you get the question is asking you to like describe the structure, just know that the medulla oblongata is important in involuntary function. And with the medulla oblongata, she has over here, she's written vital reflex center. So what she basically was saying was that it contains vital reflex centers. So contains, why does it do that? Contains vital, oh my gosh, vital reflex centers. Okay, and an example of these vital reflex centers would be the control of breathing. I don't think. Control of breathing, circulation, and digestion. Okay. That won't work. Yeah. So, and all of these things are involuntary. We don't have a control over them. So when you think of medulla oblongata, you're thinking involuntary function, and everything involuntary, i.e. breathing, circulation, and digestion. So these things are, for example, respiratory control center. So what she also mentioned was that with respiratory control center is that this center is important in initial breathing. And the reason why we know that the respiratory control center is contained in the medulla oblongata is because, again, it's going back to this, right? This is where involuntary function happens. So yes, so this is in the medulla oblongata, respiratory control center. So moving on, the medulla oblongata also contains non-vital reflex center. So it contains both vital reflex centers and also non-vital reflex centers. So let me see if I can do that in another color. Probably I can do it in green. Vital reflex center and non-vital reflex centers. So that's the take-home message. And an example of non-vital reflex centers are like coughing and vomiting. For example, the chemoreceptor trigger zone. This trigger zone actually is important in vomiting, because actually when it's triggered, when the CTZ is triggered, it causes vomiting. Okay, so yeah, that's the medulla oblongata. So remember, when it comes to medulla oblongata, you want to say 3 things. The first thing is that it controls involuntary function. Let me not do that in blue. It's important in involuntary function, and this is where the vital reflex center is contained, and also non-vital reflex center. And then you can give examples. For example, the respiratory control center for vital reflex centers, and then this chemoreceptor trigger zone, which is part of the non-vital reflex center. So those are the 3 things that you want to say. Okay, so moving on to the midbrain. So take home message is that the midbrain contains the substantia nigra. Don't know why it does that. Yeah, the midbrain contains the substantia nigra, and the take-home message is that the substantia nigra, this is important in the control of movement. And she doesn't go into any more detail. With the substantia nigra, she goes into more detail when it comes to Parkinson's. So yeah, that's it. So that's the brainstem. You're probably thinking, oh my gosh, thank God. Yeah, that's the brainstem.